Hello, everyone. This is my presentation on social media regulation in the First Amendment. I'm Claire Osterfeld, obviously, and this is for journalism, law, and ethics. So before I dive into the meat of the presentation, I'm going to look a little bit at what's coming. So everything is painted on this slide in front of you, as you can see. I'm going to start by discussing my personal connection to the research and then move into what my research questions were, what my argument was, and then a general discussion over the most important takeaways from the research, and then conclusions, including limitations of the study and future directions for research and next steps, and then, of course, works cited and questions. So to begin, me and my research, my idea for this research came from an article that we were assigned to read for the first exam we took for this class. And the article looked at a specific instance where a court ruled that the Biden administration had overstepped First Amendment boundaries when coercing social media platforms into censoring misinformation surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic. I found this to be really, really interesting because of the First Amendment and the freedom of speech and the government interfering with it. It just seemed to me from before reading into it that it would just be considered really wrong. And I was really intrigued at the end of the article when I read that the White House and the Biden administration actually backed up their decision, even after the court ruling, stating that they were just trying to work in the best interest of public health and safety. And as a journalist and a frequent social media user, this case really caught my interest because the First Amendment doctrine dictates a lot for journalists. And I just really wanted to know more about government interference with speech, specifically on social media, and then kind of like content on social media as a whole. So after doing a lot more research, I developed my research questions. So the first question in a more broad sense is how, if at all, should content on social media be regulated? And then my second question asks if there are any situations where government interference with content posted on social media could be justified. So all of this leads into my argument. So my argument was that content posted on social media does need to be regulated. And the regulation needs to avoid bias or viewpoint discrimination, blatant censorship, and government interference. And the end goal, is to find ways to regulate content on social media that completely avoid government interference. But where things are right now, that's not possible. So there are times when it might be justified for the government to step in, and I'll get a little bit further into that in the discussion. So we'll start off by discussing something that was really important starting all of this research and starting to find ways to answer the research questions, and that was defining social media companies as private entities. So in NetChoice LLC versus the Attorney General of Florida for the United States Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit, they backed up the idea that social media companies are considered private entities and therefore are entitled to First Amendment protections. So this has been defined by multiple courts. Social media companies have been ruled as private entities by all of them, but there have been a few dissenting opinions on whether or not they are considered private companies, but the overwhelming opinion is that they are. And so for the purposes of this study, they are considered that, and they are afforded these First Amendment protections, and they are protected even further by the 1996 Communications Decency Act. And this defines content providers as any person or entity that is responsible in whole or in part for the creation or development of information provided through the internet or any other interactive computer service. So content providers equal social media platforms. And this Communications Decency Act is a really big reason why it's so hard for these social media internet providers to be held liable for the content posted on their platforms, because it sort of defines them as these content providers that are therefore private companies, that are therefore protected by the First Amendment and entitled to regulate content on their sites how they see fit. So that creates a whole new problem, because when they're allowed to self-regulate content posted on their site, who's to say that they don't just remove content that they don't agree with? And it's also a partisan issue, because conservatives are arguing for more censorship and conservatives are arguing for less censorship and liberals are arguing for more censorship, with things like racism, misogyny, homophobia, and other forms of hate speech. And so there really does need to be a way to regulate the content, and it needs to avoid viewpoint discrimination, blatant censorship, and government interference. So justification of government interference is what I'm going to talk about a little bit next. So like I said, there are situations where the government does need to step in, and these situations include times when people share speech on these platforms that is not protected by the First Amendment. So if somebody gets on and makes a true threat, which is defined by the Supreme Court as statements where the speaker seriously communicates their intent to act with unlawful violence toward another person or people, even if the threat is not actually carried out. So if somebody gets on social media and makes this true threat, that's not protected by the First Amendment. But as of right now, many of these companies don't have proper self-regulation or effective self-regulation techniques in place. So this content isn't getting removed. And if it is, it's not being removed in a timely manner. The damage could already be done. And so I'm arguing that in these situations, it is justified for the government to step in and remove the content. And hopefully one day, with the implementation of more effective self-regulation strategies, it will no longer be necessary. But as of right now, it is justified for the government to step in when speech protected by the First Amendment is shared and not being taken down. So 2 ways presented in this study to regulate content on social media while avoiding viewpoint discrimination, blatant censorship, and government interference. The first is social media oversight boards introduced by Trent Sherman in his research. And these boards would they would be established independently by the social media companies. They would not include government interference at all. And they would just be boards of people who are completely neutral. They are not acting in their self-interest, and they're not acting in the interest of the company. They're completely neutral boards that review content that was taken down by these platforms and decides whether or not that was fair. So they're really doing this outside of viewpoint discrimination and outside of blatant censorship, because they are reviewing the content before taking it down. And I think if every social media platform had an oversight board, that would be a really great way for them to regulate content in a fair way. Of course, for this to be accomplished, the members of the board will need to be up to date on education on relevant media laws and how they might apply in certain situations. And then, of course, they need an understanding of the social media industry as a whole. Another way to kind of help in the content regulation that follows the 3 guidelines I've presented over and over is algorithm modification and moderation. So algorithms, most social media platforms use them, and they sort of decide what content gets amplified. They are showing you content maybe from users that you don't even follow, and they're boosting it up in your feed. And Grafanaki in her research argues that the rising popularity of fake news isn't because there's more fake news available. It's because these algorithms are boosting the fake news stories. She actually discussed in her research a case that found that after the 2016 election, the most popular fake news stories trending on social media got more engagement than the most popular fake news stories from respective media outlets. So that's crazy, and that shows a clear need for content regulation if the fake news stories are more popular than these stories being released by these outlets that have fact-checking things in place. So if these social media platforms would just modify the way their algorithms work or moderate their algorithms, then they could change how fake news is spread and fake news is boosted. And that's a really misleading and dangerous form of content. And so Grafanaki is asserting that a regulation of the algorithm, even on such a small scale, could have a massive impact on the spread of fake news, and would be a really great way for some dangerous content to be regulated. So those are kind of the solutions and the answers to the research question. In some, social media content must be regulated. And social media companies could regulate through social media oversight boards or through the modification of their algorithms. There are 2 really great ways to do so that follow in line with the guidelines presented at the beginning of this presentation: avoiding viewpoint discrimination, avoiding blatant censorship, and avoiding government interference. When a user shares speech that is unprotected by the First Amendment and the social media platforms make no moves towards removing the post, government interference can be justified. People need to know that they can't go online and threaten a bunch of people and not face any consequences. And so, yes, as I mentioned earlier, eventually the hope is that these social media platforms will find their own effective way of regulating content, including unprotected speech unprotected by the First Amendment. But as of right now, government interference could be justified. As you can see on the slide in front of me, there are some limitations to the study and future directions for research offered. So there's just a lot of existing research on the study that made it a little bit complicated to include all perspectives. And of course, everybody has an opinion on the First Amendment, so it was hard to avoid bias in the research that I gathered for the study. And then future directions for research, 3 important questions that I think could be answered in the future is beyond misinformation and true threats, what speech could warrant removal from social media platforms, and then how exactly is hate speech defined, and how far does someone have to go before their hate speech is regulated? So that is everything I have. This is my works cited. These are all of the works cited in this presentation. And then this is my email. If anybody has any questions, thank you so much for tuning in.